translations of the Upanishads and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So he was absorbed for at least 12 to 15 years in the Hindu tradition, and then he decided on a Bollingen Fellowship, actually, they paid him to travel to the Far East and see what it was like, see if he went looking for confirmation of the theories that he had learned from Zimmer and so forth, and what he found was total disappointment. And in particular, the contrast between India and Japan was so enormous that it sort of precipitated in his imagination the necessity for writing about the differences between the cultures. He went to India in the mid-50s, this is the post-Gandhi period, and everything was talk of politics and patriotism. India was in the process of forming itself as a modern industrial nation state with its politics traced out largely through Western stencils. And India was, everywhere he went, he would, beggars were constantly coming up to him and asking for alms, bakshish, and all he saw was bhakti, the pious devotion to divinities, but he couldn't find living examples illustrating the deep metaphysical traditions of India, which he had been studying in Zimmer's works, except in a few isolated cases. And it actually turns out to be the climax of his journey in India that he does, in fact, meet a real holy man who gives him a message, and it's a simple little one. He says, just meditate on where are you between two thoughts? It's almost a sort of Zen koan, and Campbell began thinking about it, and he realized that sort of where are you between two thoughts? You can just sort of drop through the bottom there into the abyss. And he said the other problem that the sage helped him resolve was, he said, if everything in the world is a manifestation of God, every particle, every rock, every tree, every stone is Brahman, how then can we say no to the evils that are in the world, the stupidity and the ignorance? How are we to regard that as divine? And Campbell said, shouldn't it be the case that we should actually affirm the evil and the stupidity and the madness and the horror in the world through a grand saying of yes to every aspect of life? Isn't that really what's implied in this spiritual affirmation of divinity in everything, everywhere? And the sage says, yes, you are on the right path. The realization is coming to you. You're getting it exactly. This fundamental insight of a transcendence of mere ethical systems of good and evil, which are emphasized in the Western tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to the final, ultimate, profound insight, which is, according to this tradition, amoral and transcends your mere human judgments that we put on things. So that sort of gave him confirmation that he had gotten the message correct of India's great traditions. But his disappointment with India on the whole, with everyone sort of, everywhere he went, people were talking about communism and how great it was, and they were begging for alms from the West in the large sense of pulling all the industry over from the West and getting aid and grants and so forth, but then turning around and bad-mouthing the West and saying that we're shallow and materialistic and so forth. He just didn't care for that. So when he went over to Japan during this time, he found the exact opposite attitude. There's a wonderful affirmation of life there. There was no sense of the dirt and filth of everything. Everything was sort of clean and formal, and he admired the Japanese professionalism and their attitude. They were just really sort of with it. It was like the difference between a shabby neurotic and somebody who was together. And the contrast between those two, sort of the whole personality of contemporary India versus the personality of Japan, made him realize we have to bring out these differences. And so that's why he wrote the Masks of God, to show what the different culture styles are of each of the cultures. And he sort of, just to give a brief note on that, he sort of divides the contemporary modern world, in which he describes us as living in this kind of gigantic cultural garbage dump, with all these ancient mythologies disintegrating around us to sort of just pure detritus everywhere. And it can be divided into 4 domains geographically, and there's a key figure in each of these 4 domains which characterizes the world outlook and style of these. The line is drawn right through Persia here, and Persia is actually on the side of the west, and everything east of Suez is more or less regarded as the east. And he says, but with respect to the great creative centers of the East, we have India and China, of which he regards Japan as an extension of China, somewhat along the lines of America being an extension of Europe. And he says, the primary figure that characterizes the world outlook of India is the Buddha. You will notice on all the great classic works of art in India that the eyes are closed on every single one of the statues. The Hindus aren't here. The world idea in its inception and in its inspiration, is to contact the transcendental ground of being within, to close the eyes to the world and drop into that sort of bottomless abyss. And there can be a renunciation of the world, the ultimate aim of moksha being liberation from it altogether, and that's, you end up producing a kind of monkish asceticism, and that is the tradition of classical or original Buddhism, but then later you get the Mahayana Buddhism where it turns around and ends up embracing the world precisely for the very reason that the realization ultimately is that it is all divine, so why say no to it? You can find divinity anywhere. I mean, just read Viktor Frankl's experiences in the concentration camps in Man's Search for Meaning. The whole thing was a revelation to him. So the Buddha characterizes India, and the wandering sage characterizes the Chinese mentality, the sort of figure of Lao Tzu, the Confucius. Here the eyes are open, and the primary sort of architecture of the world is based on the counterplay of the Tao, the yin and the yang, and the sort of wandering through the world and not trying to control it. There is a kind of attempt to control in the Hindu culture world the phenomena of what happens to you by controlling your thoughts, disengaging from them, mastering them. There's a kind of control neurosis there, but with respect to China, you simply find out what the Tao wants and you roll along with it. For example, there's an old Chinese story about a flood that comes, and one emperor deals poorly with the flood by wanting to build these huge dams, and he dams up all this water, and then the next, the great legendary emperor comes in and he says, why don't we just build canals, and we can channel the water instead of working against it. And this is the sort of Chinese doctrine of Wu Wei, the idea that not you just don't do anything, but you find out which way the Tao is going to go and you sort of roll along with it. With respect to what he terms the Levant, and this is the Near East, the great creative centers there, the great religions are Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Zoroastrianism, are characterized primarily by Job. The attitude of submission to the divine in Job is the attitude generally characteristic of the Levantine mythological world. Islam means submission to the will of Allah. So all these traditions are quite consistent with regard to that submission to God. God is the final word, and not only that, built into this is the idea of the consensus, the group consensus. Everyone must agree, and that you will find in all of these great traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And there is no regard for individual thought in these traditions. There's an emphasis sort of on the group, the village, and life in the world. There's an ethical emphasis that begins to come in here too as well, and that historically actually begins with Zoroastrianism. And there is evidence that Zoroastrianism is actually a deliberate inversion of the Hindu mythic world. For example, the two great gods in Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and Angra Mainyu, are actually, it turns out to be, Ahura Mazda is a transposition of the Hindu Asuras, and which are the Titans, the negative gods in the Hindu tradition, but yet Ahura becomes the primary deity of beneficence and goodness and right conduct. And the devas in India, which are not the devils, but the great gods, become devils. So there's a deliberate turning around of the symbolism, probably on the part of Zoroaster himself, who also rejected yoga entirely as the way toward liberation. As far as Zoroaster was concerned, and he lives about 1000 BC, and the Hindus and the Persians could not long have been separated from each other. They come from the same stock, the Indo-Aryan stock, going back to like 2000 BC, because the language affinities in the Gathas, the early sacred texts of the Zoroastrian, are very close to Sanskrit. So Zoroastrian comes out of this early matrix. And Zoroaster himself comes on the stage and he says, well, no, the world is fallen, and you are to put yourself in accord with what we think of as the good, with following the righteousness of society. And life is not to be affirmed unconditionally, but affirmed with respect to a correction, which is namely, we say yes to it on the condition that we are gradually working towards a restoration of the light. And so you get the progressive idealism, particularly insofar as it becomes intermixed with social idealism in the West, beginning with that Zoroastrian inflection. Those who are on the side of the good are serving the light, and those who are on the side of the bad are in service to the god of darkness, Angra Mainyu. and the world itself is fallen, nature is fallen and corrupt, and there is no divinity in it. So why would you find divinity within yourself and go off into the forest and practice yoga if the whole thing is regarded as corrupt? And that becomes the founding religion of the Western Levantine tradition, Zoroastrianism.